Welcome back to summer service. No jacket, no tie, just a little bit different, but most importantly, still at a distance and for this foreseeable future. Although, of course, we are talking about how to reopen, how to do it safely, what does it mean, and as soon as we feel that we're able to, we will, although we know that it won't be in time for high holidays. We're working incredibly hard to make sure that the experience you have on high holidays is deeply, deeply meaningful. I promise you that my efforts now are fully devoted to making sure that not only is the music of high holidays or the teaching of high holidays going to feel real and meaningful and new, but also the feeling of high holidays will be something that you can experience at home. We're talking about what to do for those of you who are not members of the shul and want to be guests at our service. We'd love to have as many people as possible. Obviously, it has to be done fairly, so we're working on that. More information will be coming out. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to renew, every renewal counts. We watch it very carefully, and every name is meaningful and mentioned, and we'd love to be able to welcome you back. We know that it's a hard year. We know that it's virtual. We know that for some of you it doesn't sound right, doesn't feel good, but we want to tell you, number one, we're with you. We're all feeling it. And number two, we will make the experience connected so that it won't be a waste of time or energy. And when we do reopen, we'll be able to pick up where we left off and continue the warm, intimate, engaging conversations and learning and music that we've had. This week, there's a lot going on. I have to tell you that every week there's so much to talk about. I choose not to talk about many things that are being covered in the news. Some of them are frivolous, some of them are important, but not really the place for a pulpit. I want to focus on our traditional text because I think within it has so much about what drives humanity, but also about politics. So I don't have to speak directly to politics if I can talk about the text through which I can channel some of the great conversations and challenges we have even in our modern era. And the text I want to focus on today is the one that Moses speaks when he's telling this young generation, mostly young, about what the meaning of Judaism is. And he talks to them about how they came to be, their ancestors, the slavery in Egypt, and here they are in the desert. They're on the cusp of the end of Moses' career and entry into the land of Israel. Joshua is going to take over momentarily. Literally within weeks, Moses is about to die, and they will then begin the long-awaited journey into the land. And they're sitting there, just imagined, in whatever encampment it is in the desert, and they're studying with Moses. And it's a week-long session, essentially, in which the book of Deuteronomy is conveyed. And Moses is telling them everything they need to know about their history and about what it means and how it's going to affect them. And he chooses to talk to them about the ask that Judaism has of them. What is Judaism asking of you? It's like the Kennedy idea, ask not what this country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. In essence, he's saying, ask not what you can do for Judaism, ask what Judaism asks of you, and then you'll know what you can do. Well, he lays it out. And I just want to say that Moses comes up with a long list of what's expected. But he starts off suggesting it's not a lot. And I want to tell you, in my life as a young child, relatively young, not as young as Allegra. Allegra, if you're watching, good morning, I love you. And it's really about something that comes across initially as sweet and then turns out to be something quite different. I also want you to know that I'm going to end this conversation about Moses talking about the reduction of what Moses says by one of the prophets, and within there lies much of the political discourse I've referenced, and also human psychology and so on. So when I was young, I'd have people come up to me and say, Yossi, why are you not frum? Why are you not observant? Why don't you wear your black hat? Why do you have to wear pink running shoes? Why do you have to wear, a sweater with, design on it? Why can't you just wear a blue, nice, yeshivish sweater? Why do you have to wear fancy shirts? And I wasn't the fanciest or most fashionable kid. I just thought it was ridiculous. What's wrong with Argyle? Like, what's the big deal? I just didn't understand it, and at some point I took it from not understanding to acting out on it because I really thought it was quite ridiculous. And I got into trouble, of course. Those were big deals, like non-conforming. And of course, that non-conformity led to many other things. The length of your hair, the way your kippah was on. When I was a kid, I always wore my kippah off to the side, literally like hanging off my head like this. And we weren't allowed to use bobby pins. Bobby pins was not acceptable in our world. So we had to have big enough kippahs that could stay on their own, but I always wore it over my ear, like literally over my ear. And I remember one of the rabbis, I don't know whether he was referencing me or not, said one day, if you wear your kippah off to the side, or your yarmulke as they called it, crooked, it's a sign that you're going to be crooked. And maybe, I don't know if I shook my head, I agree, or I shook my head, I don't agree, or I didn't even shake my head, but that was the kind of direction that you were told, and every little nuance mattered, which means while suggesting, hey, this is a beautiful lifestyle, it has many, many, many components of conformity that after a while, to me at least, seemed very, very draining, tedious, and heavy. So let's look at how Moses addresses the people to suggest that it's easy to be an observant Jew. And when I say observant, I don't mean in the modern sense of observance, I mean in the ancient sense where they're given a book of law and interpretation, and now Moses is saying, you need to conform to the new laws and the new ideas we have, and here they are. So if you are following this text, you can find in the weekly portion that we read, and it's chapter 33, verse 12. But I read it a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I apologize. But the truth is, that's how I read it, because these are lectures I've been given in my lifetime. And now, Israel, what does God want of you? Only that you remain in awe of your God, your Lord, so that you will follow all his paths and love him, serving God, your Lord, with all your heart and with all your soul. You must keep God's commandments and decrees that I'm prescribing for you today, so that good will be yours. And it continues. Now, when someone comes to you and says, how hard is it to be Jewish? Keep God's commandments, be a good person. What would they say to you? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the whole rule of the Torah. That's what Rabbi Hillel did. But he took this chapter, everyone took this chapter, and here it continues. If you go a little further, the heaven and the heaven of earth, the earth and everything in it, all belong to God. Your ancestors had closeness with God. God loved them and chose you. Remove barriers from your heart. Don't be so stubborn. God is the ultimate supreme being and the highest possible authority. He is the great, the mighty, the awesome God who does not give special consideration or take bribes. But God does bring justice to the orphan and the widow, loves the foreigner, granting them food and clothing. You must show love to the ger, to the foreigner, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Remain in awe of your God. Serve him, cling to him, and swear by his name. He is your praise, your God, the one who did for you all these great and awesome deeds that you saw with your very eyes. And it continues on and on and on and on, and until it gets to chapter 11, verse 8, in which it says, safeguard the entire mandate that I am prescribing to you today, so that you will be strong and come to occupy the land which we are crossing to occupy. You will then long endure on the land that God swore to your ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it starts off with, Yingala, little boy, what are we asking you for? We're asking you just to do everything, all of it, all the time. Subjugate yourself, submit. You're nobody, you're nothing. You do what we tell you. There's law, there's rules, you follow the rules and follow the law. How hard is that? That's easy. There's only 613 million commandments. What's the big deal? Every part of your life is monitored. You have to conform every nuance of your life, how you cut your nails, how you tie your shoes, when you get your hair cut, who you marry, who you love, who you live with, what you say, what you do, where you go. We're not telling you anything, except everything. And that is what Moses tells the young people of a new generation. There are times, as you saw interspersed in this conversation, that they are told things that sound very much like what we'd want God to tell us. Take care of the stranger. Take care of the widow and the orphan. But Moses, his approach was, it's all or nothing. And while some people may say, that's fantastic, you're all in or you're nothing. Well, I wasn't all in, but I wasn't nothing. And I don't believe that you're all in or nothing. And neither did the people of Israel, because they nodded their heads, and they did, after that, Ish kol hayashar be'enav. Each person did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And once they came into the land of Israel, and they divided it up, they lived in peaceful communities. And what governed them was what they thought was right. They had leaders, they had judges, they had monitors, they had prophets. They had a woman named Deborah, who was a prophetess and judge of Israel. She ran the national integrity of the people. And they lived for many years that way until eventually there was the rise of the kings and all the drama that comes from having a king, and again, subjugating humans, which is probably not a good thing at all. Having said that, the words of Moses, these lofty ideals of you'll be fully, absolutely in awe and submissive to God and follow every single commandment, was not observed. It ultimately became the flip side, which is everyone did what they thought was right. But we know in a society in which everyone does what they think is right, you're going to have people who think right and people who think wrong. And is there an absolute truth? Is there a subjective or objective truth? It's hard to know. There's a lot of deep philosophy that goes into the question of what is absolute truth, and is there an absolute truth? And can truth be proven? Can you absolutely prove what is right and what is wrong? But let's assume for the moment that in a healthy society, people would do within a range of what's right and wrong. Like murder is wrong. In the case of the ancient Israelites and many societies, capital punishment was right, murder wrong. So there's this gap between when it is a consensus that an act has to take place, but an individual acting of their own anger and their own volition is not acceptable and has the death penalty. Things like, an animal destroying another animal. Things like leaving, maybe a few 100,000 tons of explosive in the port of your city for 6 years. Yeah, that is a violation of everybody in your city and in the world. So these kinds of things that violate human space, this is not kol hayashar be'enav. Each person doing what's just in their eyes does not include extorting, exploiting, and hurting. But human nature is such that there needs to be justice, because not everybody left to their own devices will do the right thing. Having said that, eventually there's call for a new code of living that is impossible to achieve simply by individuals. There has to be a code. So the prophet Micah comes up with a code. And the code that he comes up with is in chapter 6, verse 8, which happens to be the text above the ark at Beth Torah congregation. And it goes like this: Higid lecha Adam matov, mortal. By the way, Kaplan, in his genius, Aryeh Kaplan, refuses to translate Adam as man because it's clearly not man, and it's not mankind. It's a misuse of the word. So he says mortal. The point about Adam, when someone is an Adam, means that they return to Adamah. So that's about dealing with mortality. Mortality is what governs our lives more than anything else because we have a short window within which to act. So right-thinking people act well and do good their whole lives, not just at the end or at the beginning. So he says, mortal, God has told you what is good and what God demands of you. Listen carefully. Unlike Moses, Micah doesn't say just everything. Micah says nothing more than to act justly, love kindness, and walk modestly or humbly with your God. In one of the great interpretations of the Torah, one of the books we use of Rabbi Hertz, he quotes the idea that this is not the minimum of religion. Do justly, love kindness, and walk humbly. He says it's not the minimum, it's the maximum of religion. And the prophet completely reimagines the essence of Jewish goodness as one in which we are kind, we are loving, we are just, and humble. And if you think about that, first of all, the gall or the power or the subversion of the prophets to shrink the words of the great and holy Moses into something so redacted, it sounds almost entirely universal. What is Jewish about that? But yet it persists. And as I mentioned earlier, Hillel goes one step further and says the entire Torah can be taught to someone who came to convert and was teasing Hillel. And Hillel said, how could I possibly teach you the Torah while you stand on one foot? Shammai, Hillel's partner, colleague, threw him out and said, don't be ridiculous. You want to convert? You study for years. Study everything. Learn every law. Learn how to behave. Learn, and then come back to me. And Hillel said, you want to learn the entire Torah on one foot? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Learn to love the person near you, your friend, your neighbor, your family, as you would like to be loved. A further reduction. And then the Talmud goes even one step further, which is really what I would consider the absolute maximum of Jewish and probably human responsibility. Ma de alecha snei, what you hate, what is hateful to you, and this is in Aramaic, what is hateful to you, what is despised by you, what is unliked by you, but is unwanted, undesirable, what you do not want in your life, don't do to someone else. Now that, my friends, if that is your mantra, we would live in a very different world. Very different world. I think about that a lot. How would you feel if that happened to you? How would you feel if someone did that to you? How would you feel if that was you? Most people, telling the truth, would say, I don't like it. So don't do it to someone else. It's that simple. There's so much bad behavior that we call infantile, juvenile, immature. It's all about the fact that people do not empathize with someone else. They do not put themselves in someone else's shoes. They find a way to demonize or devalue the other, so they no longer have to have a calculation. How do I feel if that was done to me? Well, they do the Nazi analogy, which is, that's a cockroach, I'm a human. I can do it to a cockroach. If that was a human, I wouldn't do it. And then whatever cause is in their brain, whatever it is, whatever rights they're fighting for, whatever needs they have, whatever it is, the fact that they will do to someone else what they wouldn't do to themselves or their brother or their mother is because they've diminished the other, so they're no longer other. They are no longer a human. They're no longer a value. And therefore, they can do to them whatever they want. And the Torah's teaching is, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You love someone so they become your friend, just like you, and if you wouldn't like it, don't do it. Moses gives us a gigantic set of obligations, most likely impossible for people to maintain. Moses also gives us little bits and pieces of the great universal teachings of Judaism. But I always feel that were it not for the dreamers, and I use an example that's a little politically fraught, and I'm not using it positively or negatively, so please, I don't really want to engage in the politic of the story, or who said it, or who they really are, or who funded them, or what corruption. I'm not interested. What I want to talk about is the idea, when you want change, change is not always easy to get by coming to the table with what you really want. Because if you came to the table with what you really want, your opposition now will slowly but surely break away little bits of what you want before you end up, you've eroded your ask. You end up with half of what you want. So you come to the table with twice as much of what you want. You erode half of it, you still ended up with what you wanted. When America is talking about a reimagined civilization in which the environment is a priority, you have people who come to the table with a new Green Deal, which at the face of it has an interesting and good and positive intention, but in so many ways has a ridiculousness attached to it that it is impossible. Anyone as an outside observer, and I'm part of those people, looks at it and goes, you don't really believe that this is the solution. What you really want to do is lay out the solution in this ridiculous way, in this impossible to achieve way, and then work backwards to achieve some compromise. In other words, a negotiation where everybody loses is a success. Fair enough. We need to get people to start understanding how dangerous that in the imaginary 12-year clock, it's probably at 11, it's probably 10 now, who knows, of the destruction of the world because of a loss of environmental interest. And you have to come up with this new Green Deal that will radically shift America, will basically end up in a green society, and everything about the world will change. And then there's the opposition, which is absolutely, it's ridiculous, there's no climate change, there's nothing going on, everything's fine. Take off controls on emissions, take off controls on sensitive wetlands, just take it all off, there's nothing. The question is, does it have to be that way? Should it be that way? And the answer I understand is, if you have good meaning parties on both sides that are bringing ridiculous issues to the table, but they're at the table, they'll both lose, but we'll end up with something important. And that is a simple example of how things get done or not, and the health of your political system determines whether even ridiculous ideas that are somewhat beyond the pale, and ridiculous responses that are somewhat beyond the pale, maybe the status quo is beyond the pale, have to find a way to come together. In a healthy world, you probably don't need to be ridiculous on either side, but we're not in a healthy world. And I believe that this is the teaching we have between Moses and Micah. We have polar opposites. One is, it's easy to be Jewish. All you have to do is a million things, everything. Don't stray or you're dead. And then we have Micah, which is like, hey man, this is easy. You just love, you just be good, and you be humble. Somehow, Micah doesn't really answer all the questions. Moses doesn't answer all the questions. Moses is not realistic, and Micah seems not formed enough. But when the Talmud tells us what you hate, don't do to someone else, then the question becomes, well, what do I have to do? I hate the idea of working 24 hours a day. Well, then, of course, you're going to go back to your text and say, what did the Torah say about rest? The Torah says you rest on Shabbat. When you think about how you want to treat your neighbor financially, emotionally, sexually, physically, all the issues that are laid out in the Torah and the subsequent books of Talmud and law, it was clear that this absurdity of dialogue is part of the natural process of getting to the middle. Because I think, and I stand by it, that I think that I've been able to achieve it, and that people who are with me have been able to achieve it. We have found a way to balance between the Jewish utopic ideal of pure observance and the general universal principle of goodness. Somewhere in there, we've put in a set of rules that are based on our ancestral documents, on our historic teachings. We found a way to be good people, to be caring people, to be honest people, to have a universal bent of goodness, at the same time, a particular guide from the Torah. And it all stems from the almost absurd conversations that we're having, especially this one that always struck me as highly improbable. But now I've come to realize, of course, that you need Moses so that you seek an alternative. When you seek an alternative, you find yourself back in the middle, embracing the teachings of the Torah. It's a great way of learning about what the Torah means when it speaks, because too many people read it and say, I'm out of here. And that could have been me, but it wasn't. I embraced the possibility, and every year there's new and new learning that can be done. And even at a distance, I think you can read along these texts. That would be the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 11, and did I say 33 before? I meant 10, and chapter 10 and 11, and the book of Micah in chapter 6, verse 8. And that is the text that's above our ark. And find yourself in the middle. Where do you fit in between the universal and the utopic? Shabbat Shalom. I hope it's a good week for everyone, a week of healing and health. May our numbers stay low, and may our smiles stay high. And to all who need help, please reach out. We're here to help you. Shabbat Shalom. We'll be back in a few minutes.